The Arizona desert holds secrets in its shadows. Abandoned settlements where fortunes were made and lost, where desperados walked dirt streets, and where the promise of wealth drew thousands into some of the harshest terrain on Earth. These weren't just mining camps. They were complete communities with schools, newspapers, and grand hotels that rose from nothing and returned to dust just as quickly. What remains today tells stories of ambition, violence, and the relentless pursuit of mineral riches that define the American frontier. 14 ghost towns scattered across Arizona's unforgiving landscape represent the boom and bust cycle that shaped the West. Their crumbling walls and silent streets stand as monuments to an era when a lucky strike could transform a prospector into a millionaire overnight, and when entire towns could vanish within a generation. Swansea. The massive stone smelter rises from the desert floor like an ancient ruin, its towering walls scorched black from decades of intense heat. Swansea wasn't a gold rush fantasy. It was an industrial operation designed to extract copper from the harsh Arizona desert and turn it into profit. In 1909, the Clara Consolidated Mining Company established Swansea along the newly constructed Parker Railroad line. The location was strategic, positioned to process ore from the nearby Signal and other productive mines in the region. The company invested heavily, constructing an enormous smelter complex with a 325-foot smokestack that could be seen for miles across the desert. This wasn't a tent camp thrown together by optimistic prospectors. Swansea was a company town built with corporate capital and industrial ambition. The smelter roared to life, processing tons of copper ore daily. Workers operated around the clock in shifts, feeding the furnaces that glowed red through the desert nights. The town that grew around the smelter reflected its industrial purpose. Rows of identical company houses, a company store where workers spent their wages, and few of the saloons and gambling halls that characterized earlier mining camps. Management kept tight control, and the railroad brought in everything the town needed. At its peak, roughly 750 people called Swansea home. The town had electric lights powered by its own generating plant, a luxury many frontier settlements never achieved. The company built a school, and families settled in despite the brutal summer heat that regularly exceeded 120 degrees. Water had to be hauled in by rail, making every drop precious in this parched corner of Arizona. But Swansea's fate was tied entirely to copper prices and ore availability. When World War I ended, copper demand plummeted. The mines that fed the smelter began to play out, and by 1924, the operation was no longer profitable. The company made the cold calculation that businessmen have made countless times in the West. It was time to shut down. The abandonment was swift and thorough. Workers were given notice, packed their belongings, and boarded trains heading elsewhere. Within months, Swansea stood empty. The smelter, which had cost a fortune to build, was simply left to the desert. Salvagers eventually stripped away anything valuable, but the massive stone walls were too substantial to dismantle economically. Today, those smelter ruins dominate the site. The walls still stand, defying the decades of desert winds and occasional flash floods. Scattered around the main complex are the foundations of company buildings, rusted machinery half buried in sand, and fragments of the narrow-gauge railroad that once connected Swansea to the outside world. The town serves as a reminder that even well-capitalized industrial ventures could fail in the West when the economics shifted. Total wreck. The name alone captures the dark humor that prospectors used to cope with the uncertainty of mining. Total Wreck wasn't named for its eventual fate. It earned the name from a comment made during its founding, and the irony only became apparent decades later. In 1879, prospector John Dillon was exploring the Empire Mountains southeast of Tucson when he discovered a rich vein of silver ore. According to legend, when he showed samples to his partner, the man examined them and declared the prospect a total wreck. Whether he meant the claim was worthless or was simply being sarcastic remains unclear, but Dillon registered the claim under that name anyway. As it turned out, the Total Wreck mine would produce over $1.5 million in silver, making it one of the more successful operations in southern Arizona. A town sprouted quickly around the mine entrance. By the early 1880s, Total Wreck had several hundred residents, multiple saloons, a general store, a post office, and the rough infrastructure typical of remote mining camps. The silver came out of the ground in impressive quantities, and ore wagons made the difficult journey to Tucson regularly, hauling the wealth that kept the town alive. The miners who worked the Total Wreck faced the same dangers that plagued all underground operations: cave-ins, bad air, and the constant threat of hitting a pocket of water that could flood the tunnels. Several men died in the shafts over the years, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses on the hillside above town. Mining was never safe work, and the remote location of Total Wreck meant that injured men had limited options for medical care. The boom lasted about a decade. By the early 1890s, the richest veins had been exhausted, and the remaining ore wasn't worth the cost of extraction. The mine owners tried to keep the operation going, but the economics no longer made sense. When the mine closed, Total Wreck died with it. There was no reason for anyone to stay in this isolated spot without the mine to support them. The post office closed in 1890, and within a year or two, the last residents had drifted away. Total Wreck became what its name had always suggested it might: a complete ruin. Time and weather erased most traces of the town. Today, only scattered stone foundations and mine tailings mark where hundreds once lived and worked. The Total Wreck mine entrance still exists, sealed now for safety, a dark opening in the mountainside where men once descended daily in search of silver. Harshaw. Deep in the Patagonia Mountains near the Mexican border, Harshaw represented the international character of Arizona mining. The silver and lead deposits discovered here in 1873 attracted miners from across the American Southwest and from Mexico, creating a diverse community in one of the territory's most remote locations. David Tecumseh Harshaw, the town's founder, recognized the potential of the ore deposits and moved quickly to establish claims. Within a few years, the Harshaw mining district was producing significant quantities of silver, and a town emerged to support the operations. By 1880, Harshaw had grown to nearly 2,000 residents, an impressive population for such an isolated location. The town's main street featured more than a dozen saloons, several general stores, a butcher shop, and multiple boarding houses. The Flux Saloon and the World's Fair Saloon competed for miners' wages, staying open around the clock during boom times. A weekly newspaper, the Harshaw Bulletin, kept residents informed of local events and mining news. The town even had a brewery, ensuring a steady supply of beer in the desert heat. But Harshaw's remote location created constant challenges. Everything had to be hauled in by wagon over rough mountain roads. Water was scarce, and during dry periods, it had to be brought from springs miles away. The nearest railroad was in Patagonia, requiring a long wagon journey to ship or concentrates to smelters. Violence was another constant concern. Harshaw sat close to the Mexican border during a period of frequent cross-border raids. Bandits occasionally struck at isolated mine operations or ambushed ore wagons heading to the railroad. The town had minimal law enforcement, and disputes were often settled with guns rather than courts. Several men were killed in saloon shootings over the years, their bodies buried in the hillside cemetery. The boom began to fade in the late 1880s as the richest deposits played out. By 1890, production had dropped significantly, and residents started leaving for more promising camps. The post office closed in 1903, though some mining continued sporadically into the early 1900s. A brief revival occurred in the 1930s when rising silver prices made it worthwhile to rework old tailings, but this was short-lived. Today, Harshaw is thoroughly deserted. Stone foundations and walls are scattered through the canyon where the town once thrived. The old cemetery remains, with weathered wooden markers and a few stone monuments still standing. Mine entrances dot the surrounding hillsides, and rusted equipment lies abandoned where it was last used. The site captures the isolation that frontier miners accepted in pursuit of mineral wealth. Duquesne. Just down the canyon from Washington Camp, Duquesne represented an even more ambitious corporate venture. Founded in the 1890s by investors who formed the Duquesne Mining and Reduction Company, this town was designed from the beginning as a company operation with strict management control. The company discovered extensive lead and zinc deposits that warranted major investment. They constructed a modern concentrator, brought in the latest mining equipment, and built company housing for workers. Duquesne was laid out in an organized grid, a stark contrast to the haphazard growth of prospector camps. At its height, around 1900, Duquesne had approximately 1,000 residents. The company store was the economic center town, where miners purchased supplies on credit against their wages. Company housing was assigned based on position. Management lived in larger homes with better locations, while workers occupied smaller, identical structures. This class division was typical of corporate mining towns, but created resentments that occasionally boiled over into labor disputes. The Duquesne operation was profitable for its investors, producing steady quantities of lead and zinc ore that was shipped to smelters in El Paso and other locations. The company employed both American and Mexican workers, with Mexicans typically assigned the most dangerous underground positions while receiving lower wages. This discrimination was standard practice in border mining operations, but contributed to tensions. Life in Duquesne followed the rhythms of shift work. Whistles signaled the change of shifts, and the town operated around the clock. The company maintained order through strict rules. Alcohol was officially prohibited in company housing, though bootleggers operated discreetly. The company also controlled access to the town, and union organizers were unwelcome. The mines began to decline after 1910 as the richest ore was exhausted. The company tried to maintain profitability by cutting costs, which meant reducing wages and laying off workers. By 1920, Duquesne was in steep decline. The final blow came when the company decided the remaining ore wasn't worth extracting and shut down operations entirely in the late 1920s. The abandonment was orderly and complete. Workers were given notice, the equipment was removed or sold, and the company wrote off its investment in the town infrastructure. Within a few years, Duquesne stood empty. another victim of the boom-bust cycle. Today, Duquesne's ruins are more extensive than many ghost towns because of the substantial original construction. Stone and concrete building foundations remain, along with portions of the concentrator and other processing facilities. The town's grid layout is still visible in the arrangement of foundations. Like Washington Camp nearby, Duquesne serves as evidence of how even well-capitalized corporate operations ultimately failed when the ore ran out. SASCO. The acronym stood for Southern Arizona Smelting Company, and the town that bore this name existed for one purpose: to process copper ore from mines across the region. Built in 1907, SASCO represented industrial-scale mining operations that had become standard by the early 20th century. The company constructed an enormous smelter complex capable of processing hundreds of tons of ore daily. The smelter's design incorporated the latest technology, with multiple furnaces, ore roasting facilities, and a system for capturing and processing the smoke that contained valuable metallic particles. A tall smokestack, reportedly over 150 feet high, dispersed the toxic fumes across the desert. SASCO's location was chosen for practical reasons. It sat along the Southern Pacific Railroad line, allowing ore to be brought in from multiple mines and processed copper to be shipped to markets. Water was piped in from wells several miles away, and coal for the furnaces arrived by rail from New Mexico. The town that grew around the smelter reached a population of about 600 people. Most residents worked directly for the smelting company or in supporting businesses. The company built housing, a company store, and basic services, but SASCO never developed the saloons and entertainment districts of traditional mining camps. It was a working-class industrial town focused on production rather than prospecting dreams. The heat from the smelter operations made SASCO unbearable in summer. Workers toiled in temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees in the shade, and inside the smelter buildings conditions were far worse. The smoke and fumes created health problems, and accidents were common in such a dangerous industrial environment. Several workers died over the years in explosions, falls, and other incidents. SASCO operated successfully for about a decade, but change in economics doomed it. After World War I, copper prices collapsed, and many of the mines that supplied ore to SASCO shut down. Without sufficient ore to process, the smelter became unprofitable. The company closed operations in 1919, and SASCO died almost immediately. The ruins today are among the most impressive ghost town remains in Arizona. The massive stone walls of the smelter still stand, scorched black from years of intense heat. Arches and doorways lead into empty chambers where furnaces once roared. Scattered around the main complex are foundations of company buildings, rusted machinery, and pieces of the narrow-gauge railroad that serve the facility. The site captures the industrial scale of early 20th century mining operations. Tip Top. In the Bradshaw Mountains north of Phoenix, Tip Top represented another silver boom that burned bright and fast. The town's optimistic name reflected the confidence prospectors felt when rich silver veins were discovered in 1876. The Tip Top mine produced high-grade silver ore that assayed at impressive values. Word spread quickly, and miners rushed to the area to stake claims and establish a town. By 1880, Tip Top had several hundred residents, multiple saloons, a hotel, stores, and a post office. The silver kept coming out of the ground, and the town seemed destined for a long, prosperous run. Getting ore out of Tip Top presented significant challenges. The town sat in rugged mountain terrain with no railroad access, or had to be hauled by wagon down treacherous mountain roads to the nearest smelter, adding substantially to costs. During winter, snow could close the roads for weeks, isolating the town completely. Water was another constant problem. The surrounding mountains had limited springs, and during dry periods, water had to be rationed carefully. Miners working underground in hot, dusty conditions needed significant water, and the stamp mills that processed ore consumed even more. The town's water supply system was never adequate, creating hardship during summer months. Despite these challenges, Tip Top thrived for several years. The mine went deep, following silver veins hundreds of feet into the mountain. Miners worked by candlelight in the cramped tunnels, drilling blast holes and loading ore into cars that were hauled to the surface. It was hard, dangerous work that claimed lives when tunnels collapsed or miners fell down shafts. The boom ended suddenly in the mid-1880s when the silver veins pinched out. The mine operators tried desperately to find new ore bodies, drilling exploratory shafts in multiple directions, but the silver was gone. Without the mine, Tip Top had no reason to exist. Residents packed up and moved on, and by 1890, the town was essentially abandoned. Today, very little remains of Tip Top. Stone foundations mark where buildings once stood, and tailings piles show where the processing facilities operated. The mine entrance still exists, though it's now sealed for safety. The remote location means few visitors make the difficult drive to see what's left. Tip Top serves as a reminder that rich strikes could appear suddenly and disappear just as fast, leaving miners scrambling for the next opportunity. Octave. The Bradshaw Mountains held numerous gold deposits, and Octave was founded in the 1880s when prospectors discovered particularly rich veins in this rugged area. The Octave mine became one of the region's top producers, yielding gold that made its owners wealthy and attracted hundreds of miners hoping to share in the bonanza. Octave's location was spectacularly remote, even by frontier standards. The town sat at high elevation, accessible only by rough wagon roads that wound through the mountains. Supplies had to be hauled in at great expense, and getting ore out to smelters required long, dangerous journeys. During winter, snow often closed the roads entirely, forcing the town to rely on whatever had been stockpiled. Despite the isolation, Octave grew into a substantial community. At its peak, several hundred people lived there, and the town had the full range of frontier businesses: saloons, stores, boarding houses, and even a small hotel. The Octave mine employed dozens of men underground, and the stamp mill that crushed the ore employed additional workers on the surface. The gold deposits were rich but not infinite. By the early 1900s, production had declined significantly as the best ore was exhausted. The mine owners tried to keep operations going by mining lower-grade ore, but the remote location made this increasingly unprofitable. Transportation costs ate up most of the returns, and eventually the owners decided to shut down. The closure hit Octave hard. Without the mine payroll, businesses failed almost immediately. Residents drifted away to other mining camps or left the mountains entirely. By 1910, Octave was effectively dead, though a handful of prospectors continued to work marginal claims in the area for years afterward. The site today shows scattered ruins in a heavily forested mountain setting. Stone foundations and collapsing wooden structures are barely visible among the trees that have reclaimed the town site. Mine entrances dot the hillsides, many now caved in or deliberately sealed. The remote location means Octave sees few visitors, slowly decaying in the mountain wilderness that made it so difficult to reach in the first place.